Hey everyone, I'm Carmen, Ms. Digital Editor, and I'm here today with Elana K Arnold, author of DAMSEL, which I'm super excited to talk to you about. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
And so I feel like the way that I would describe DAMSEL is that it sort of picks up where all the other fairy tales leave off. With this prince carrying this princess away, and the character in the book sort of she has to really deal with the consequences of these fairy tale endings that we've all seen so much growing up with them, and in films and in books. And I'm sort of curious about, I always like to ask about like the inception story of a book, and so I'm kind of curious, where did reimagining the fairy tale begin for you? Like, how did you start that process?
So yeah, that's a great question. So my previous two books were a book called What Girls Are Made Of, and a book before that called Infandus, and I like to think of them as my embodied female shame duology. For a variety of reasons, I grew up really physically ashamed of existing in a female body, and I wrote about it for two books, and I didn't really choose to write about it. It was just what I had to write about. So, artists pull from whatever their well is, and my well was embodied female shame. And so that's what I wrote about for 2 years. And what I didn't realize is that writing those books sort of emptied the well. And I didn't write them to heal myself of feeling shame. It's just what I had to work with. But what the result was that after two books in about 5 years, I didn't feel ashamed anymore. And what else I didn't realize is that the thing about creative work is that you might feel like it's limited by what's in your well, but when it's empty, there's this groundwater underneath you can't see. And it's not until you drain the water that the well refills with something different. And this time when it was filled with rage. And I think rage is, shame is rage turned inward, and those things are very connected. And so I think it's a natural extension of the work I was doing in my last two books, except this time just the angle was different. Instead of working from shame, I was working from rage. And I know that this book was inspired in part by the books I read when I was 15. I read Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King. I read Princess Bride. I'm a big fan of, these days, of Game of Thrones. Daenerys Targaryen. I want to write a book with the dragon. And also Claiming of Sleeping Beauty by Anne Roclair, who was Anne Rice, writing erotic S&M stuff. And that was a book I read when I was 15. About a girl who was 15, actually. The character was 15, too. So I think all those things were sort of where this book came from. And when I knew it was going to be a book with a dragon and a damsel, it was going to be a novel set in a fairy tale world, which was relatively new territory for me.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, and as I was sort of working through it, I thought a lot about Women Who Run with the Wolves, which I read only recently, unfortunately, because I wish I had read that book aloud at birth. And and I was just really intrigued when I was, I felt like when I was reading that book, I was being, really awoken to this way in which all of these different allegories and fairy tales that we've grown up interpreting, even our interpretations of them are sort of through this male lens and this male gaze. And, so much of that book is about flipping the understanding of, oh, no, this is not a fairy tale about greed. This is a fairy tale about punishing a woman for this, or, so-and-so. And so I'm kind of curious, what do you think a feminist fairy tale does look like?
I think that's a great question. I think what's interesting about fairy tales is that they traditionally center females' bodies as prizes. And even when the stories are maybe consumed by girls, they've traditionally been told, they've been recorded by men. And so that is going to produce a different version of the story than one that is, or by misogyny in general, because misogyny hurts everyone, not just men. So women are hurt by it too. So women who regurgitate these same stories and use them to shame and oppress and scare girls is going to be different than a story that says, well, let's look at what language is, and let's look at what abuse is in these stories, and try to see it anyway through a female gaze, which I think the story tries to do. But I too am part of misogyny and have been raised learning that the male gaze is the primary gaze. So it still continues to be a struggle, not to mention the layer of being a white person and seeing the world. I mean, the lenses that I have are we all have so many different ways that we've been sort of trained to see things, and the process of like pulling off each set of glasses is very interesting. There's a running metaphor in this book of eyes. There's this wall of eyes that's built, and it, you know, it's sort of not a subtle sort of story about gaze and how we see things and what we see. Yeah.
Totally. Well, and I'm sort of curious, like, what drew you as a writer overall to sort of writing books for young people? And as a feminist writer and just as a creative person, like, what draws you to that body of work?
Sort of a two-part question. I write books about teens, and then I also write books that are for younger readers. I have a sort of sweet, charming, warm-hearted series about a boy who takes care of an orphan skunk kid, a boy called That. And that's sort of a very different part of my brain than the work that I do in the young adult space. So I don't think of myself as someone who writes books for teens. I think of myself as someone who writes books about the teenage experience, which I think is important, because I think for me, if I were to try to write a book for a specific audience, I would feel like I was preparing a meal and worrying about things like vitamins and, you know, if it was appropriate. And I don't think that's the job of the artist. I think my job is to soak in culture and then produce art from it. And it's dangerous if we start trying to produce something that we feel is safe or appropriate for a specific age group. So I write about female experience and young female experience because that's what I have to work with. And that's what fascinates me.
Yeah. Well, and you talked a little bit about reading on your own when you were in your teens, some more like serious, sort of heavy, and maybe inappropriate content. And, you know, this book is far from a fairy tale. You know, it deals with a lot of very real and difficult things, mental health, rape culture. And I do feel like right now we're having these conversations about conversations, right? In the wake of Kavanaugh, I think a lot of people are questioning, how do we talk to our boys? And then I know that a lot of parents in the age of Trump are sort of questioning, how do I talk to my kids at all about what they see and what they hear right now in the news and, you know, just everywhere. And so how do you walk that line as a writer, and then just also as an adult human having these kinds of conversations in real life too? How do you know, present these topics in a way that is consumable, but then also has an impact?
Yeah. Again, I don't think that I think when I'm writing about if it's going to be consumable or if it's going to have an impact. And maybe if I thought more about that, maybe I'd be a best-selling author as opposed to more of a niche, you know, writer, which maybe I shouldn't say, but it's probably true that people who find my books tend to read several of them, but there's a lot of people who read my books and maybe would say, well, this isn't appropriate, this isn't young adults, this isn't safe, this isn't okay. There was just a really great article written by, I'm forgetting his last name now, his name is Jared, and he's a finalist for the National Book Award this year for his wonderful book, Hey Kiddo, which is it's a memoir about heroin, his mother's heroin abuse and how he lost his mother to heroin abuse. And I think that there's ongoing conversation about, you know, what is YA and what's appropriate and what should we write about, and should we write about tough stuff. And the one thing I've seen that continues to be the thing that we really don't want to hear about is embodied female sexuality. That seems to me to be like the final frontier in things that really, I see readers, adult readers, not never teen readers, I see adult readers say, that's the line that isn't safe. It's not okay to talk about girls touching their own bodies, or girls experimenting with sex, or girls suffering in terrible ways. Although we do tend to prefer our girls to suffer than enjoy their bodies, I think, in literature. And I've talked to some Black writers who say the same thing about the books that tend to get the most press from their community are the ones that show suffering, Black suffering, as opposed to joy, which I think is a really terrible and interesting problem that we have.
Yeah.
That answer your question.
No, totally. And I mean, it's also curious because the idea that talking about sexual violence in a book that you could say is for young women and girls, I mean, I'm like, studies show us they're probably familiar with the terrain, you know, that these are things they're going through. They almost need someone to write about and talk to them about it in that voice, in a space where it is for them.
Sure. people say, oh, it's not appropriate to write about these things or for girls to read about them. I'm like, I completely agree that it's not appropriate that these things happen. Terribly inappropriate things happen to me all through my child and teen and young female years. But not writing about them doesn't keep the actual things from not happening. So, or from happening. So yes, I agree that it's inappropriate for girls to have to deal with terrible things, but I don't think that censoring with the literature about that experience is where we should change. I think we should change the environment so that girls don't actually have to suffer with terrible things. A book is a great place to find language for experience. You know, I didn't realize that I was being assaulted or abused. I just felt really uncomfortable and ashamed. And I didn't have language to say, oh, that's abuse, because the you know, a lot of the stuff I was reading, oh, that's romance, you know, that's love, that's how he likes you, that's just the way it is, that's what do you expect if you look like that, if you wear that. So giving language so that young people can say, oh, that's the experience I'm having, and they can name it. Language is incredibly powerful, and I think fairy tales have the power to give language to experience. I also think this book is a great place to practice saying no. If a young person picks up a book and they feel uncomfortable with the content, I want them to feel empowered, to be uncomfortable and leave the situation. You know, that's what I want for my daughter. If she's at a party that she feels uncomfortable in, I don't want her to feel trapped and that she has to stay. I want to empower people to make choices to leave situations that feel uncomfortable and not feel like I felt, which was obliged to stay and, you know, be prone, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you're sort of on that vein of how, you know, giving language to something is so powerful. What do you think the power is too in sort of doing what DAMSEL does, which is flipping the narrative and maybe expanding the narrative and sort of just varying the stories that we're being told, as especially for, you know, young women and girls? Like, what do you hope the power of the impact of that is? I guess I hope that people who read the book feel encouraged to explore the definitions in their own life and the limitations of their own language, and tell stories of their own. I think we need more stories of all sorts. And we're living in a time now where I think that there are a lot of people who want to hear from different perspectives. And my book, by limitation of being a creation of me, is limited in ways that I probably can't see. And so what I want is, I want more young people to read vastly diverse experiences that are different than their own, which means that this is a book about a girl, but it's a book for everyone. I want everyone to read my book, you know? Yeah. And so I hope young men will read the book, and then they'll begin to see their own situations differently and tell stories that are different, and young women and young non-binary people and old people too. Like it's a book about a girl, but it's a book like any other book for everyone. And I think books that tend to center young female experience, we kind of decide as a culture that those are for girls, which I think is really, again, like misogyny is bad for everyone. So is deciding that books that center young female experience are only for young females, and that the rest of us don't have anything to learn from looking closely at their experiences. I really think that speaks to the way that we don't value as a society the experiences or the voices of young girls. Yeah, and you know, you've also you touched a little bit on sort of the catharsis of writing your first two books. Yeah. What was the process like for writing DAMSEL? This was such a wonderful book to write. Writing about shame felt like, I've talked about this before, and there's actually a scene in What Girls Are Made Of that's like this. It felt like reaching into my own palate and pulling out a goiter that was like deeply attached with veins and a blood source, and or like I have this recurring nightmare that I have gum that's stuck to the top of my mouth, and I go to pull it off, but my palate comes with it, and then so does the inside of my throat. And that's what those books were. They were so slow and, you know, murky and casting back, whereas this book felt like a fire that I lit, and I couldn't stop moving forward. It was like an experience like that. It was so much. It's not I don't think it's a fun book necessarily, but it was a fun book to write. It felt like I finally had language to say things in a way that I hadn't had before. Yeah. Did it provide, like, did it add to your catharsis? Oh, for sure. Yeah, it did. I think writing this book was one of the great pleasures of my career, and it's everything that I wrote in the first draft, almost every word of it is still in the final draft. It grew in revision with the help of my wonderful editor, but
you know, the first line of the story is exactly the same, and the last page, which is that's one of my favorites. My favorite ending I've ever written is exactly the way it was when I first wrote it. And I remember when I finished it, I was in New York actually at my favorite cafe, and I finished it, and I got up and I looked around. I was like, God, the world looks just the same. But to me, it was a very different place to look back up into. It felt really empowering for me.
Awesome. Well, I'm like, I think that's all I have. Yeah. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me here and for all the important work that Ms. Magazine does. I'm a lifelong fan, so I appreciate it.
Yay!
All right.
Thank you. And everyone tuning in, make sure you go out now. It's on bookshelves now.
Yes,
DAMSEL makes a great gift for all of the young folks in your life, the young feminists. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and I'll see you guys soon.